Good morning and thank you for joining us for Eye on New Mexico today. I'm Nicole Brady and Stuart Dyson is here as well. Good to have you, Stu.
It's nice to be back again, Nicole. Great.
Always.
I'd love to get the chance to drop in once in a while and do the show with you.
Hopefully more. Maybe that'll be our New Year's resolution for 2012.
Let's work on it.
Well, today we're going to be talking about reforming the Public Regulation Commission, and you're going to learn a lot today about what exactly the PRC does, how they're involved in so many things that impact your life every single day. Of course, lately the most common reference to the PRC in our newscast has been to scandal with Jerome Block Jr.
Block Jr. Story that Gotti Schwartz of Eyewitness News broke and has pursued relentlessly all the way. Absolutely astounding behavior.
Yes, and former PRC commissioner now, of course, he's no longer on the commission. But we're going to be talking about some other things going on with the PRC. And to talk about that, we have Fred Nathan, who is the executive director of Think New Mexico. Thanks for being here, Fred.
Thank you for having me, Nicole.
Start us off by telling us what Think New Mexico is for our viewers that don't know.
Well, Think New Mexico is a results-oriented think tank, and we're a little bit different than most think tanks in at least two ways. First, most think tanks are either way over on the left or way over on the right, and we just feel that in a state that's 49th or 50th in too many of these national rankings that the focus ought to be on solutions rather than ideology. And consistent with that, we have a board of directors of Republicans and Democrats and independents. And then the second way that we're different is that when we issue a policy report, we don't just sit in our office and cross our collective fingers and hope something good happens. We get after it, we draft the legislation, we identify sponsors from both sides, and see it through to implementation and beyond.
The latest policy report that's out is Rethinking the PRC. I wouldn't normally think this was going to be a very interesting read. You get a booklet like this, but this is very interesting actually and very educational just about the history of regulation in New Mexico and how much the PRC is involved in. So the PRC, the Public Regulation Commission, has been a main focus for you guys of late, right?
Correct. And I sort of joke with my friends that you really don't need a think tank to know that the PRC has been broken, but this is an issue that we just felt needed to be addressed because it impacts so many New Mexicans in so many different ways.
So, yeah, run us through that. I mean, just how...
Well, first off, we're going to get back to like what the PRC does, which is truly astonishing in and of itself. But basically, Fred, what's the problem? What do you guys see the problem being with this outfit?
I would say that there's two main problems. One is they've just got too much on their plate, and we want to refocus them on their core mission, which is regulating utilities and telecommunications. And they are the most powerful, Stuart, by the way, state regulatory agency in the country in terms of regulating not just utilities and telecommunications, but insurance, motor transportation, licensing corporations, the fire marshal, ski lifts, it just goes on and on. And then the second reform that we think is desperately needed is to increase and enhance the qualifications for who serves on the PRC. And right now, under current law, you just have to be an elector, which means you're 18 years of age, you need to live in the state for at least a year, and not be a felon, which has tripped up two of our PRC commissioners.
Let me paint a picture for the audience here, and I'm kind of quoting freely from the Albuquerque Journal from an editorial that ran last month, our good friends there at the Journal, to set the stage, let you know what we're dealing with when Fred's talking about these qualifications. This is a $90,000 a year job, by the way, to be on the commission. You get elected to it. It's by districts around the state. 7 of them?
5.
It's 5. Why did I? There's 5. Okay. Not good with numbers. But here we go. Commissioner David King cost the state $841,000, nearly $842,000 for a sexual harassment settlement. E. Shirley Baca, another commissioner, busted at the Albuquerque Sunport for having drug paraphernalia in her luggage. Commissioner Sandy Jones knowingly and willfully hired a twice convicted embezzler to a $70,000 a year job with the PRC. And Commissioner Carol Sloan had her state wages garnished for non-payment of debt, but more importantly, and people are going to remember this one, she's the one who went and took a rock and bashed in her husband's girlfriend's skull And she is now a convicted felon, had to be kicked out of office, removed by our state Supreme Court. And lastly of all, I give you Jerome Block, convicted of public urination, who lied on his campaign finance report, misused his state credit cards, the infamous chimichanga incident, and the weird gas purchases, pleaded guilty to multiple felonies before resigning. This is what we've got sitting here. And Fred, you know, these are the kind of New Mexicans who are deciding what?
Everything from your electric rates to your gas rates, water rates, insurance, even, you know, going to the hospital, what the ambulances can charge and who can operate an ambulance or a taxi cab or a shuttle bus. So they've got enormous, enormous power.
You know, you make a great point, Stu, and the Journal obviously pointed out just the scandals that have been in the PRC. But and scandals affect all areas of government. We've had tons of scandals within the PRC and outside of it. But the PRC has problems that go beyond just the scandals and the character of some of the commissioners, that both past and present. Let's go back to the qualifications issue. I mean, we were talking before the show, some of these PRC commissioners that are earning a $90,000 a year salary don't have a college degree. Is that right?
That's correct.
That's not a requirement right now.
Not a requirement, and our proposal would would require either a college degree or 5 years of relevant professional experience, because we recognize that there's some people in the state who, because of financial circumstances, haven't had the opportunity to attend or complete a degree, and who could serve well. But on the other hand, this is a position that's like a judge, actually. And if you read the statutes for what their duties are, they're supposed to conduct themselves like a Court of Appeals judge or a Supreme Court judge. And we require not only an undergraduate degree, but a law degree for judges. So we don't think that we're proposing too much to say, at a minimum, at least a college degree or some 5 years of relevant experience.
On behalf of those New Mexicans without college degrees, I would say, you know, I'll disclose that I don't have one, and I would be a terrible PRC commissioner. But I don't think chimichangas would be a problem. I've got no
you have the
plans.
relevant experience to be here, though.
Yeah, I do for here. Yeah, I think so. It ought to count for
Stuart,
something.
Going back to those scandals, I don't want the viewers to feel like just because we removed Jerome Block Jr. from office that solves the problem.
Right.
Our main point is that there are these major structural problems with the PRC, which existed long before Jerome Block Jr. joined the PRC, and those are those need to get addressed.
Well, tell us about some of the things you would do. You're talking about taking some of this body's responsibilities and giving them to other state agencies.
Correct.
Give us an idea of some of the things that.
Well, so first we would just pare back the PRC to regulating utilities, electric, gas, water, and telecommunications. And then, for example, insurance has been sort of a stepchild over at the PRC, even though it's one of the most important things that they do. And we think that it hasn't worked particularly well. If you look at the superintendents of insurance, since the PRC began in 1996, they've all either been fired or forced out. And part of the problem is you've got 5 different bosses with competing political agendas, and so it's difficult to attract good people, although I think John Franchini, who's there now, is doing a good job. So we would make them either a separate cabinet agency or maybe roll them into an existing agency, which is what I know the governor would prefer. Something like regulation and licensing might be a good place to put that. Another great example is they have a corporations bureau, and we're one of the few states where if you want to register to become a business, it's not one-stop shopping. You have to either go to the Secretary of State's office or the PRC, and at the PRC, it's like 15 days to get your license, and in this economy, we think it's really important to be as business-friendly as we can be. So we have proposed just consolidating it with the existing Corporations Bureau at the Secretary of State's office, so there can be this sort of one-stop shopping.
There's a lot of other examples in this report. I mean, I thought an interesting one was the granting operating authority to buses, shuttles, taxis, limousine companies, moving companies, and non-consensual vehicle tows within New Mexico. So the PRC actually regulates the rates for these vehicles that move people around.
And it's not just the rates, Nicole, it's market entry. So for example,
if they can
if they can either how they can even get into business. So for example, I live in Santa Fe, and we have one taxi cab company, and it's the PRC that decides whether other companies can come in. And recently there was a case where an entrepreneur wanted to start a green taxi cab company in Santa Fe, which would probably be wildly popular. And he had to go through these legal proceedings, and the law is so archaic, it requires you to notify your potential competitors. And naturally, in this case, the competitor who had a monopoly said, no, I think we're just fine in Santa Fe with one taxi cab company, and made it so onerous. He filed a 200-page legal brief, not including affidavits, making the case that this guy should not come in. And the entrepreneur just finally threw up his hands and said, this is getting too expensive, and gave up. So we're destroying jobs or potential jobs. And really, in many cases, we have monopolies all throughout the state. So we'd like to see the free market really decide who can get a license to get into the motor transportation business, whether it's moving vans, shuttles, buses, taxis, limousines, ambulances, the whole. But you're also right, Nicole, in that once you get that license, you don't decide the prices you charge your customers. So if you're a taxi cab company in Deming, it's the PRC in Santa Fe that decides what the rate will be. And deregulation, whatever you think about deregulation, I think it's been at the federal level with airlines and trucking, it's been shown to be a huge success for consumers and for business.
That is a great example. I mean, I'm just thinking of a cab company in Deming. It would be one of the poorest pockets of the state, highest unemployment, and yet you got guys sitting up in one of the more expensive parts of the state deciding what the cab company has to charge per mile.
Yeah, and in fairness, they do go down, they travel the state and visit, but in those cases, I think the market really is a better way to decide what those prices should be. It's good to have them regulating, whether those motor transportation companies have insurance and whether they're safe. I think that's appropriate, but market entry and setting prices probably it would be addition by subtraction to take those duties away.
And that was another kind of leading into another case. Some of it is about getting rid of the regulation whatsoever, but a lot of this has to do with just sort of moving the jurisdiction of the PRC to other agencies that in many cases the report points out are already overseeing some of these things. For example, ambulances, as you mentioned, which the Department of Health already has their finger in that pot as well.
If it's an air ambulance.
If it's
a ground ambulance, then the PRC regulates. If it's an air ambulance, the Department of Health. And we think we should just...
It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make very much sense at all.
Wow.
So some of the report is really focused on what other agencies in the state could maybe assume some of these responsibilities more efficiently, more effectively.
Right.
Are those other agencies ready to assume those responsibilities?
Well, we haven't gotten to that, but I did talk to the superintendent of regulation and licensing, and he said he'd be more than happy to consolidate insurance in his department. He's already got banking and securities, and it would really make a lot of sense there. But we haven't gotten around to all the cabinet secretaries yet.
To do that.
Go on. I'm looking up something. I got a question. It may have to come in the second half.
Okay. Well, actually, let's talk about some of the other points that the report makes, actually. Money. I mean, a lot of this comes down to streamlining the PRC itself. We could make it a more efficient organization, remove some employees. How many people work for the PRC? I mean, we have the 5 commissioners, but there's also a huge staff, and part of the report looked at, we could make this just a more efficient organization to begin with.
Yeah, it's about 240 employees. And what's so compelling to us and really heartening to us is after we came out with the report, 2 of the PRC commissioners endorsed it. The chairman, Pat Lyons, and the most senior member, Jason Marks, one a conservative Republican, one a liberal Democrat. And it's sort of unusual, and I think Stuart can attest to this, where an elected official says, I think it'd be in the public interest to give some of this power away or give it to other agencies. That's, testimony against interest is, I think, what the lawyers call it.
And both those commissioners you named are thoughtful guys who've been around the block. Not all commissioners are crooks or dopes like the ones whose names I read earlier. yeah, I'm calling names.
Yeah.
They're not all meatheads like that. There are people who've served on this commission and who are currently serving who want to do the right thing and who want to do the people's business in the right way.
That's a really important point, Stuart. And I want to point out, the whole Jerome Block incident was started by the Chief of Staff, Johnny Montoya, going to law enforcement and saying, what he's doing with this state gas card is wrong. And so there's some good people there, and we should be careful to point that out. I should be careful especially. There's some really wonderful public servants that work there who are trying to do the right thing. And they're the ones who are our biggest proponents and who are, supporting what we're doing and saying we need to upgrade this agency. And Johnny Montoya is a great example of a terrific public servant.
That's a great point to make. We're going to take a quick break, but we're going to be talking more with Fred Nathan and more about the PRC when we come back. Thanks for staying with us this morning for Eye on New Mexico. We've been talking about the Public Regulation Commission, what we can do in New Mexico to make it a more efficient and effective organization, clean up some of the corruption, and just make it make more sense. That's been the mission of Think New Mexico. We've been talking with Think New Mexico's Executive Director, Fred Nathan. Again, thanks for being here, Fred.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been talking about all these ways the PRC could be reformed. Most of it has to do with making sure the commissioners are qualified, as we pointed out, know what they're doing since they do have a lot on their plates, and kind of removing some of the responsibilities, making sure that the PRC hones in on its focus, which is regulating utilities and telecommunications, those things. There's an interesting story behind how the PRC came to be, the history of it, because it started out maybe as a utility regulating agency and kind of expanded. How did that happen?
Well, actually it was two agencies. It was the old State Corporation Commission, which dates back to the founding of the state, and the Public Utility Commission, which regulated utilities. That was appointed, State Corporation Commission was elected, and there were lots of problems with the State Corporation Commission. And so back in 1996, a bill was thrown into the hopper with 2 weeks to go in the session to merge those two agencies. And nobody thought it had much of a chance. It immediately got sent to 4 different committees just on the House side, which is generally the kiss of death. And then it just started to move. It went to its first committee and got a no recommendation, which is sort of legislative parlance for, we're not really sure about this, but we'll let the sponsor fight for another day. Then it went to Business and Industry, which is a committee that usually kills bills, and somehow it got through there 5-4, and then it started picking up some momentum, and it gets to the House floor with 12 hours left in the session. So it seems dead because then it would still have to go through the Senate. So the House passed it thinking, I think, that the Senate would probably kill it. And then Senator Manny Aragon assigned it to one committee, and with an hour left in the session, and Stuart's seen this before, I'm sure.
I saw this happen.
You probably saw it happen.
Yeah, I was there.
With 1 hour to go, he blasted it out of committee and made it the next order of business, and the Senate passed it, and then it went to the voters because it was a constitutional amendment. And remarkably, it passed 51 to 49%. It was in a year with a long ballot, presidential election, you had a Senate election, congressional elections, the entire legislature was up for election. And then right there at the bottom of the ballot were 7 constitutional amendments, and this was number 6. And it didn't really kind of get the airing, I think, that it needed, and it wasn't really, and I think people now that are in the legislature said that really needed more study. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do 15 years later.
It was interesting. You had the very liberal Democrat Speaker of the House, Raymond Sanchez, who was an opponent of this idea, and very conservative Republican Governor Gary Johnson agreed. They thought it was, even back then, they looked at this, both guys looked at it from their points of view and said, we're asking this agency to do too much. I think that was both guys.
And Gary Johnson also said, I think we're going to get some unqualified commissioners.
Oh, you're
really?
kidding me.
Yeah, so he was very prescient, and so was the Speaker. The Speaker said this is way too powerful, and of course it was, and it still is. It's, as I said, the most powerful state regulatory agency in the country.
Wow. So here we are 15 years later, even though some of this was known back then, it sounds like. What were we going to say?
What's it going to take to undo some of this? I mean, does it have to go through that? Can it just be the legislative process, or do we have to, all these changes have to be a constitutional?
Yes, so when the bill was passed in 1996, it was actually passed as a constitutional amendment.
Wow, okay.
So we're going to present the legislature, it gets a little complicated with 2 constitutional amendments. One, to enhance the qualifications, which is straightforward. The other is to to hone the PRC back to its original core mission, what the PUC used to do, regulate utilities, and then say, and any other additional duties as set out in statute. So that's the first step of a three-step process. Second step is it's got to go to the voters and be passed. And then in the 2013 session, if we complete those first two steps, we'll go back to the legislature and ask them to remove some of those duties that are now at the PRC, like insurance, like corporations, motor trans, and a few other things.
And you know, I got to tell people, when Fred comes in and, you know, presents a report like this, when Think New Mexico gets behind something, I say the odds are you're going to see it happen. It may not happen on the timetable that he would like, but they keep coming back with it, and modifying the idea, communicating with lawmakers, and by golly, sooner or later, things tend to happen when these guys get involved.
Well, thanks, Stuart. We get lots of help. I should say we've got some friends in the legislature who have carried our bills through the years that have been outstanding, and the media has been, you know, for example, with this PRC proposal, we're delighted that we already have 7 endorsements from newspapers all across the state.
Wow.
And so we get a lot of help from other people.
Well, and certainly it's been so high profile, unfortunately, for some of the scandals lately. But you guys have bipartisan support for changes. It sounds like it wouldn't be hard for many people to say, you know, we do need to take another look at this.
Yeah, and that's really been our strategy all along, ever since we started 12 years ago. Our board is, as I said, bipartisan. So, for example, the chairman of the board is a former Republican governor, Gary Carruthers. We have a former Democratic Attorney General, Paul Bardicke. And our strategy has always been to try to drain the politics out of some of these issues and to telegraph to both parties, you know, it's really not about partisanship. This makes sense whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And this is a sort of a classic example of that this is a body that really needs to be reformed.
Well, why don't we mention some of the things that you've accomplished in those 12 years of Think New Mexico?
So I think we're best known for getting a full-day kindergarten law through the legislature back in 2000. And then, as you pointed out, sometimes it doesn't happen on our timetable, and a great example of that was repealing the tax on groceries, which took 3 years, and then it came back a few years later, and we were able to bringing back the food tax. So that was number 2. Then we created a strategic river reserve to keep a little bit of water in our rivers, and that brought together the agricultural community and the environmental community working together. Another project was to reform our lottery, and that system was sort of going bankrupt. The demand for the scholarships was so much higher than what the lottery was bringing in, and there was some discussion of cutting back these scholarships from a full tuition scholarship to maybe 50%. And we looked at how the lottery was being funded and the scholarships were being funded, and too much money was going to the administration of the lottery. And we said, look, we can cut back on the administration and get more dollars to the scholarships, and worked with some bipartisan sponsors. And then our last initiative that we got to the finish line was reforming title insurance, which is a profoundly unsexy topic, but very important in this environment in terms of making it easier for people to afford a home and to pay closing costs.
So a real variety of topics there.
You guys had all right, this past session, I tend to get lost in the jumble of bills, but you had a real good ethics bill.
Yeah, and that's one that we haven't got to the finish line, and I'm delighted you brought it up.
Yeah, it should get to the finish line, is my view of it.
Yeah.
Tell us a little
Well,
about
at this time, I mean, ethics has been proposed by so many people,
this
ethics
would stop
reform.
a whole mess of pay to play, I think.
Exactly right. We mapped out some of these corruption scandals that have been occurring in the last decade or so, and the common denominator always seems to be government contracts and lobbyists. So we looked around the country at what other states have done, and one of the things that impressed us is other states have banned political contributions by those two groups, government contractors and lobbyists. And the courts have upheld it when it's narrowly tailored to fight corruption. And so we thought it was a great idea, and we sort of struggled. We got it through the House 1 year, and then it didn't get a hearing in the Senate. And but we want to bring it back. Next year will be difficult because it's a 30-day session, but we're hoping maybe some of your viewers can call the governor and encourage her to put it on the call. so that we can fight that fight another day. And I think it's something that would be consistent with her agenda, which has been about fighting corruption. So we're optimistic that we might be able to get that back on the agenda.
I looked at that bill and I couldn't see a doggone thing wrong with it. And this, we all know this pay-to-play thing is just killing us here, and it's got to be stopped. So it seems to me they should have passed it, but they don't do what I think is right.
Yeah, I wish you were in the legislature, Stuart. It'd be easier, but we've got some allies there, and I think its time is going to come, and unfortunately we're probably going to need one more scandal to get it over the finish line. And
God, as if we haven't had
That
it.
is, yeah, I know. It is. It's sad that it takes these scandals to bring anything to the forefront and get anything done. But yeah, in this case, obviously with the PRC, it's been probably one of our biggest stories of the year, the Jerome Block Jr. scandal, and certainly came at the right time when we're looking at reforming the PRC as a whole.
we get too much credit. People think that we timed this report, that we wrote it over a weekend.
Exactly. It had nothing to do with this. Yeah.
Right. We had been working on it actually for a year, and it was just dumb luck that when we got it back from the printers was the week that Jerome Block finally resigned. So it was fortuitous in that sense.
Yeah, and certainly Stuart pointed out all the other scandals, but I mean, essentially, yeah, what we've been talking about today is just that, just common sense solutions to reforming an agency. And last question here, kind of, how do we make sure that the other agencies in the state and other bodies in the state do pick up some of these responsibilities efficiently? Will that be another part of getting this passed?
That'll probably be the next session after we get the constitutional amendments passed. But I'm optimistic, and the governor's office has said positive things about the report, and so I'm hopeful that they'll be willing to take on some of these duties and handle some of these responsibilities and take them away from the PRC.
Shuffle things around a little bit. The report pointed out we could save $1 million by kind of making some of these changes. Is that just $1 million a year, or
annually?
Annually, okay.
Just in terms of economies of scale. For example, merging those two corporation bureaus, one at the Secretary of State and one at the PRC. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, Fred Nathan, for being here today. We're running out of time here, but thanks for the work Think New Mexico did. I think if anyone wants to see this full report, they can probably find it, right?
Just go to our website, www.thinknewmexico, written out as one word.org.
All right. Check it out. We'll see you next week for another Eye on New Mexico.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.